All right. Welcome to the BSI Subspace Virtual Talks, co-sponsored by the Center for Translational Research in Neuroimaging Data Science and the IEEE Signal Processing Society. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Pierre Blanc. He received the engineering degree from École Polytechnique in 2015 and the Master of Science in Communications and Signal Processing from the Imperial College London in 2016. He then received a PhD degree from INRIA in 2019 and on the subject of independent component analysis for brain processing under the advisement of Jean-François Cardoso and Alexandre Gramford. He is now a postdoctoral researcher at École Normale Supérieure de Paris in the team of Gabriel Perret. And his research interests include brain signal processing, numerical optimization, theoretical foundations of deep learning. Dr. Blanc has made several exciting research contributions on Hessian preconditioning, acceleration, and descent guarantees for likelihood optimization in ICA, modeling shared responses in neuroimaging studies, and more recently, the development of Spectral ICA. Today, he will be presenting noise-independent component analysis for brain signal processing, challenges and opportunities. Dr. Blanc, thank you for being here and sharing your time with us today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rogers. So I'd like to begin, of course, by thanking you and BSI for having me today, and I'm very honored to give this talk today. So the title of my talk is Noisy Independent Component Analysis for Brain Signal Processing, Challenges and Opportunities. And so it's a work that I mostly did during my PhD with these people that I would like also to thank a lot. And it was a pleasure working with them. So I will start. The first part of this talk will be mostly a tutorial about independent component analysis. And so I know that you had a talk last time with Apo Ivarinen, who is one of the godfathers of ICA. So I will see if, I will go quite briefly about it, but still try to be pedagogical. So the focus of today is a method called independent component analysis. And for short, I will always refer to it as ICA. Okay, this is just shorter. And so I will start with a very simple analogy. So it's what we call the cocktail party problem. And so the thing is the following. So you are at a cocktail party and you are basically chatting with somebody, and you are listening to what the person in front of you is saying. And when you are listening to this person, there are some other sounds that are coming into your ears. So these are, for instance, the discussions from other people, or maybe some music, or the chatter of the room. And basically, the point is that you can separate the signal of interest, which is the sound of the person you are talking to, and the rest of the noises. And when you are doing this, so basically it's your brain that is processing these signals, and your brain is performing what we call in statistics or in signal processing, this is called a blind source separation. You are managing to separate as input, you have some signals, and you are separating it into interesting components. And that's the basics of source separation and of independent component analysis. And so I will try to be a bit more clear about what I mean, and so I will formalize the problem. And so we have what we call sources. Okay, I will always call them with a little s, okay, S1 all the way to SP. So here we have P sources. P is the number of signals, if you want. So S1, S2, and S3. And here, each one corresponds to, here this is like, this is just a sound wave, okay? So this is the sound of somebody talking, and S2 is the same thing, and S3 is the same thing. And these are the three sources of interest. And then what gets into your ear are what we call the observations. So here I will call them X. And these observations, so to simplify things, I will assume that I have as many observations as sources. Okay, so I have 3 sources and I have 3 observations. And these observations, you can see that they involve S1, S2, and S3, but we don't really know the link between these two. So the first thing that we need to do is to clarify this link. And so the first question is, how can we, what can we say between the link, I mean, what is the link between the sources and the observations? And of course, there are many, many ways to do so. And today we are talking about ICA, and ICA makes a linear assumption. Okay, so the sources, I can write them down as a vector. Okay, a vector of size p. The observations as a vector of size p as well. And we assume in the whole talk that the link is linear. Okay, so X, the observations, is going to be the product of a matrix A times the sources. And so A is what we call the mixing matrix. And here, I assume that we have as many sources P as sensors P, and so A is square. And so just to give you some insights, last time at the previous talk, Apu Ivarinen told you about nonlinear models, where here the link between X and S was something different, a more complicated transform, which was nonlinear. But here we are in the simple linear setting. And the great thing about this linear setting, and which is also permitted because A is square, so because of linearity and because we have as many sources as observations, we can recover the sources from the observations. Okay, the sources are simply given by inverting the mixing matrix. Okay, so we have this very simple transform between X and A and S. So just to be a bit clearer and a bit more pedagogical, so we have the sources, we have the observations on the right, we have this linear link. And so basically here, what I did to generate these observations, I took X1 as a linear combination of the three sources, okay? 2 times the first one, plus 7 times the second one, plus 8 times the third one, etc., with different numbers every time, okay? And in the end, I have this linear relationship with this mixing matrix, which is here, A, and you see that the columns of the mixing matrix corresponds here. So the number, the first column of the mixing matrix corresponds to the coefficients in front of S1. Okay, so these are the how much S1 is present in each of these observations, and the same goes for the rest. And so the whole problem is the following. So you are at this cocktail party. What you get are these three signals. Okay, so of course there is the first thing is that if you are usually human people only have two ears, and so basically here of course we assume that we have a way to capture three different signals, which is a bit weird, but for the sake of the argument, let's just pretend that we have 3 ears, and basically you only get this. Okay, you only know what are the observations. What you want to recover are the sources. Okay, you want to know what are the sources, but you only know the observations. You know neither the sources nor the mixing matrix. Okay, you don't know any of this, and so the goal is to take the observations as input, and as output predict the sources and the mixing matrix. And so if I state it like this, it sounds kind of weird, because you see that you have many possible solutions, and it's not a well-defined problem. And so we need some further assumptions in order to have a well-posed problem. And there are many such assumptions, but the basic assumption of ICA, which is why it's called ICA, is that the sources have what we call statistical independence. So if you are doing statistics, it just means that the probability of seeing the sources at the same time factorizes as the marginals, and that's it. And so it means that the activity of the first source and the second source are completely independent, and it goes, of course, beyond decorrelation. And the point is that the point of ICA is that that's the only assumption that we make. Okay, so ICA is basically a linear model with an independence assumption, period. Okay, so you see already that it is a very simple model, because you have a set of very simple assumptions. And the goal of ICA is, as I said, I give you these observations. Okay, so I give you this X, and you want to recover both the independent sources S and the mixing matrix A. And so a first question that you can ask yourself is whether it is possible. Okay, and so this question is okay, can I actually define a mapping that maps X to the sources and the mixing matrix? And this question in statistics is called identifiability. So I think that Apo talked about it at great length last time, but this is one of the core questions of ICA. And the first thing is that you could say that the answer is obviously that you cannot recover the sources from the observations for two reasons. And basically the reason being that there are some trivial indeterminacies in ICA. Okay, and these indeterminacies are the following ones. So the question is, okay, the question more formally is that I give you X, okay, so I give you these observations, X1, X2, and X3. I know that it's equal to a certain mixing matrix times the sources. And now the question is, can I find another set of mixing matrix and sources that will generate the exact same signal? And here you can say, of course I can, it's very easy. You can just, for instance, swap, okay? So here what I did is I swapped the first and the second column of A, and I swapped the first and the second source. And of course, it gives me exactly the same output because the linear combination stays the same. Okay, so this swapping operation will never change the outcome. And so it means that we have what we call a permutation indeterminacy. Okay, we cannot determine, basically we cannot give an ordering into the sources. We cannot say that, okay, this source, it must be the first one, this source must be the second one, etc. There is no way to tell. And of course, you have another indeterminacy, which is the second trivial indeterminacy, which is that of scaling. Okay, and the point is that here, if I multiply the first column of A by 2, but if I divide the first source by 2, of course, I will end up with, in the end, the same decomposition exactly. If I do the other way around for the second column of A, so if I divide the second column of A by 2 and multiply the sources by 2, of course, I also get the exact same output. And so it means that I have what we call a scale indeterminacy. And so in ICA, these two indeterminacies are what we call the trivial indeterminacies. And so we basically get rid of them. We say that they kind of do not count. And so we say that ICA is identifiable when there is only one mixing matrix and one type of sources that generate the output up to scale in permutation. Okay, so there is only one defined up to a scale and up to a permutation. And the point is that then, under this definition of identifiability, ICA is identifiable under some very weak conditions. And so these conditions are basically that the sources should not be pure Gaussian white noise. And so the most famous theorem about identifiability of ICA is the non-Gaussian case, okay? And so this was maybe the first one to exist. And this theorem says that if all the sources except maybe one are non-Gaussian, then the model is identifiable. And so non-Gaussian, by that we mean that when you look at the density of the function of the signal, sorry, it should not be a Gaussian. But that's not the only one case where you have identifiability. Another case that would be very useful today is that the model is identifiable when the sources have non-proportional spectra. Okay, so it means that the sources are time correlated. Okay, and so if your sources have some time correlation, and that so when you look at their power spectrum, it's not the same for each source, then you have identifiability of ICA as well. Okay, so one thing that is important is that you can actually have an identifiability result for ICA when the sources are completely Gaussian. Okay, the point is that it should not be white noise. Okay, it should have some frequential diversity. And you also have a similar result when you have some non-stationarity, but I will not talk about this today. Okay, so now, this was a bit of on the theoretical side of ICA, and now about ICA in general. So ICA is used a lot in many observational sciences because it basically you give to the ICA you give it a matrix of mixed signals, and it's going to perform source separation. And so it's used, for instance, in astronomy. It's used in biology. It's used in mechanical engineering. But of course, today I will talk about the main topic, which is neurosciences. And so I will also focus mostly on MEG and EEG. Okay, so when you're recording here, when you're recording EEG, so as you all know, you put a helmet with some sensors, and each sensor is going to output a time series. Okay, and so in the end, you are going to have some signals that look more or less like this. And so you have this multivariate time series, and you have so the number of signals, which I call P, can be so okay. It can even be 1 or 2, but when you are in a clinical setting, you have or in a research lab, you have P that goes from 10 to 300. Okay, so when you have a big MEG device, you have 300 sensors. And so the whole point is that this time series, they are obtained. I mean, they are you can relate them to the activity of the brain by Maxwell equations. Okay, and this physics equation, they say that the propagation of the electrical and magnetic fields are going to be linear and instantaneous, and so it's one way to justify the processing of these signals with ICA. Okay, and actually, ICA has been used for quite a while to process these signals and to do many very interesting things. And so, for instance, when you apply ICA here on some EEG signals, so on top here, these are the raw signals. I mean, they are not raw because they are extremely clean, so they have been cleaned a bit. But in spirit, these are the raw signals. And so you see each line corresponds to one sensor, and you see that you have some very, very correlated signals, actually. Okay, you see that the first signal and the second signal look more or less the same. And then when you apply ICA on all of these signals, it's going to try to separate these into very independent components. And so you end up with the decomposition at the bottom. And so you get these time courses, which are now independent. And the great thing is that ICA is completely blind, so it takes this as input and it tries to find a decomposition of independent components. And in the end, just by maximizing independence, you recover something that is very meaningful for the neuroscientist. Okay, because of course you see that the first two signals correspond; they look like what an eye blink corresponds to. Then you have some brain rhythms, theta, alpha, and sometimes you get some mu rhythms. Then you have you can also recover the heartbeat, and you can recover some muscle activity. And this is very nice, and so it's very practical because then, of course, in your brain signal, you don't really want to have the eye activity, you don't really want to have the heart activity and the muscle activity. So what you can do is then just cancel these channels, set them to 0, and then it will automatically give you some cleaner signals at the top. And another very important thing is that when you are performing ICA, here at the bottom, what I show you are the sources. Okay, these are the independent sources that when you apply them on brain. But you also have something else, which is the mixing matrix. And so when you look at the first line of the mixing matrix, it tells you the the first column of the mixing matrix, it tells you, for instance, for the first source, it will tell you, okay, this source has a large contribution for this electrode, and a small contribution for this electrode at the bottom of the scalp, okay? And so you can then plot a kind of heat map that will then show you where there is a large contribution for this source. And it's actually here, you can see that this source has a lot of power in the sensors that are close to the eyes, but not for the sensors that are at the back of the head. So that makes a lot of sense because the source corresponds to the eyes. Okay, and so that's a very nice example of ICA. And so, of course, this feature in this example, it comes from the amazing San Diego group at University of San Diego. Okay, so I think I will stop now for a first round of questions. I hope that everything was clear, but if you have some questions about this, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you. Do we have any questions, anyone? You may type them in the chat box or the Q&A panel.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting from Armin that everything was very clear.
Yeah, no, also I imagine that this is very redundant with what Apo told you last time. So, and you are, I imagine that there are some ICA experts in the room. So,
Sure. Yeah, probably.
So I'll wait a bit more longer, but if.
And if you want to ask a question yourself, you just raise your hand and you can unmute your. Okay, so I have something about Benaz is asking, might it be that the type of non-Gaussianity should be a burst-like activity or avalanche type of activity?
Okay, so I don't know what avalanche means, but yeah, for burst. So yeah, okay, if I can show you this. So here, what is very interesting, as you say, so here, if you look at the source alpha, here, this I think this is what you mean by burst. So it's a source that has for some time it has a very small amplitude, and then there is an activity and it starts to oscillate with a higher amplitude. And this is exactly the kind of things that ICA will recover, because this is actually a non-Gaussian source. Okay, and it's non-Gaussian in the sense that it's a source that has a lot of for a long time it is almost zero, and then for a short time, so here it's not so short, but usually you have much longer periods where the source is not active. So the source is at zero for a long time, and then it suddenly starts to have a lot of amplitude, and so this is typically a non-Gaussian source here. So for this kind of sources, an IC algorithm that would try to recover sources by looking at non-Gaussianity would surely recover this source. But another thing is that this source also has as you see, it has a very it has an oscillatory pattern. Okay, it oscillates a lot, and so it has so I don't have the data here, but I imagine that it has a very precise frequency response. And so it means that an IC algorithm that will try to separate frequencies will also manage to recover this source, I guess. So basically the point is that a source that has bursts, as you say, is a source that is usually easy to find for IC algorithms.
Thank you. Yeah, and there was a clarification that burst-like is the same as avalanche. So
okay, so I think
that's the behavior that they were considering.
Okay. All right. So if there are no other questions, I will move on to the second part of the talk. So the second part is also
good.
Yeah, cool. So the second part is about how to perform ICA in practice. Okay, so here to go from there, to go from the observations to the sources, I just say you apply ICA. But now the question, and one of my, I mean, the things that I studied in my thesis is how do you actually code an algorithm that takes as input these observations and outputs the decomposition. And so there are many ways to do so, but the most, I think to me, the simplest and the most well-principled way is to see ICA as what we call in statistics a generative model. Okay, so ICA is just a very simple statistical model. Okay, so you say that the sources have power densities, D1, dp, and these densities, you can say that they are non-Gaussian. Okay, and basically you have this very, very simple statistical model. You say that the sources follow the density D, and then the observations are A times S. And since you have a generative model like this, what is usually a very nice way to infer the parameters of such model is to perform maximum likelihood. And here, so I won't go into too much details, but basically the derivations of the likelihood are very simple. So you can just compute the probability of seeing the sample X given the matrix A, and you have this formula here, which is actually not so complicated. And then what you want to do is to maximize this thing. Okay, and so in order to make things a bit easier, what we do in practice is that we have a data set. Okay, so we have many samples. We have x1 to xn, the samples, and we have a closed form. And so the point is not really that it's in closed form. The point is that it's very simple. And the likelihood is like this. So the probability of seeing your data set given the mixing matrix is given by this equation, which is not so terrible. And then you want to maximize this. And so, of course, you see that it involves some many products. And as usual, what you are going to do is to take the log likelihood, because it transforms the products into sums. And you are going to make a change of variable, because you see that here what really matters is a minus 1 times x. And so a minus 1 times x is basically your current estimate of the sources. When I give you a matrix A that is a candidate for a mixing matrix, when you are doing a minus 1 times x, you are actually recovering the candidate sources. And so here, I will call this matrix in the rest of the talk W. And you have this cost function, which has the formula here. And so it's not so bad. And the point of ICA, and sorry, I added the minus in front, so now you need to minimize it. And how to perform ICA? Well, ICA is performed by using an optimization algorithm. And this method is going to try to find the matrix W that will minimize this cost function. Okay, so the point is that I have as input a dataset X, and then I just want to find W that minimizes this nasty cost function. And that's how most ICA algorithms work. So as a kind of interesting thing, and it's also a kind of bad thing, is that this function is non-convex. Okay, so here I take W star, which is a solution, and I take W1 and W2 two random directions, and here I plot the level lines of this cost function, and you see that it looks like this, which is very non-convex. And so, of course, it's well known, but the ICA problem is what we call non-convex, and practical implication of this is that if I start the problem from, I mean, if I have two different initialization for the problem, I can end up in two different solutions. Okay, so there is not, you could say that there is not a unique solution to the ICA problem, and so this is very well known. But if you run your algorithm twice on the same data, but starting from a different point, you can end up into different local minimum, and so you can end up with different decompositions. So that's a problem, but it's the case for most ICA algorithms. Okay, so ICA is performed by minimizing this cost function, and so I want so as I said, this is just one of the ways to perform ICA, but this is also maybe the most popular way to perform ICA. So okay, so it's not a very scientific statement, but in my experience, when you are processing brain data with ICA, chances are that you are using either of these two algorithms. So the first one is Infomax, which is the historical algorithm to process brain data, and the second one is Fast ICA. Okay, so these are, I think that these are the two most widely used ICA algorithms, at least in the neuroscience community. And the point is that these two algorithms are actually very tightly linked to this cost function. So Infomax is actually exactly solving the problem. Okay, so it uses a specific optimization algorithm, which is called stochastic gradient descent, but we don't really care about this. The point is that it tries to minimize this cost function. And the other one is fast ICA, and it tries to minimize the cost function under an additional constraint that is the decorrelation constraint. So this constraint imposes that the estimate of your sources are always perfectly decorrelated. And so the point is that the maximum likelihood approach that I presented is actually something that, for those of you in the audience that are doing ICA, you are actually using such approach every time you are fitting an ICA algorithm. So, and I think that's part of the, so when you are doing maximum likelihood estimation, you have the whole theory in statistics that states that you have some kind of what we call efficiency and things like that. And that's why it's a good idea to use this approach. And I think that's part of the reason behind the success of these two algorithms. It's because they are doing maximum likelihood. And so they are optimizing a very well-founded cost function. So first, I would like to do a very shameless advertisement. One question that you may have, and so for those of you who use ICA, the point is that sometimes when you use either of these two algorithms, it may take a very long time for the ICA algorithm to converge, okay? Because especially when you have lots of sensors, so when you have hundreds of sensors and when you have hundreds of thousands of points, as is usual in neurosciences, it may take even up to 1 hour for these algorithms to converge. And so the first question is, can we actually accelerate the convergence of these algorithms? And so I will not go into the details, but with my advisors, we came up with a method that does some what we call Hessian preconditioning. And this algorithm, we call it Picard. And you see that here, so these are some EEG data. So I don't really remember the precise data set, but these are some regular EEG data with maybe 70 sensors. And you see that, so in blue, you have the convergence curve of fast ICA. So fast ICA is trying to minimize the function. So it's trying to make the gradient norm go to 0. And you see that it may take up to 1,000 seconds to reach 10 to the -7. While with our approach, which we call Picard, in the orange curve, you can converge in 3 times faster than fast ICA. So it can save a lot of time. And so, yeah, this is a shameless advertisement, but if some of you in the audience have some algorithm, some ICA processing that takes a long time to run, and if you are using fast ICA or Infomax, you can just replace these algorithms by our algorithm called Picard, which will basically give you the same solution, but much faster. Okay. So are there some questions about this perspective on maximum likelihood ICA and the optimization of the cost function? So I didn't go into too much detail, so but yeah, I'd like to stop here to see if there are some questions.
So yeah, just reminding everyone that if you have a question, you can put them in the chat. And I have one coming from Armin. So he's asking about fast ICA and why is there a need for additional decorrelation constraints?
So it's so there are 2 parts to the answer. The first one is that so this is the decorrelation constraint, and so the point is that so this is something that I did not say, but this is actually very important, is that you have the concept of decorrelation and you have the concept of independence. And independence is a much stronger concept than decorrelation, in the sense that independence implies decorrelation. Okay, so decorrelation between 2 variables means that when I do the product of them and I take the average, it gives me 0. And I know that if these 2 variables are independent, I automatically have independence. But the converse is not true. Okay, obviously, if I have some data that are decorrelated, it does not mean that they are independent. I mean, it's not really obvious, but this is true. And so the idea, one of the ideas behind fast ICA, so there are many different things, but one of the ideas behind fast ICA is to say, okay, I know that at the solution, I want to recover some independent sources. And so since the sources are going to be independent, they are also going to be decorrelated. And so I can impose this constraint that W times X, so W times X, if I just to recall it, these are the estimates of the sources. And so I impose that my estimates of the sources at all time are decorrelated. And so this gives a constraint, and so it actually means that the matrix W no longer lives in the whole space of matrices, but lives in what we call the orthogonal manifold. And so it lives in a space of smaller dimensions. So it means that in some sense, the problem is a bit easier to solve. But then regarding specifically fast ICA, the decorrelation constraint is also crucial in order to have a fast algorithm. So fast ICA, the code for fast ICA, it's literally 3 lines of code. And this is permitted by some very clever tricks that leverage the fact that you have this decorrelation constraint. If you want to have an equivalent of fast ICA, an algorithm that converges as fast as fast ICA, but without the decorrelation constraint, you need to have a much more complex algorithm. And so it's a very interesting fact from the geometry of the problem. But you know, so it's completely different from the first answer that I gave. So I think that there are really these two different answers. The first one is that it makes sense to impose this constraint to reduce the complexity of the problem. And the other one is that fast ICA, the algorithm itself, is permitted by some tricks. I mean, calling it tricks is a bit reductive, but by some manipulations that are permitted by the geometry of this constraint. But of course, here we have here the algorithm that you propose is also constrained to the orthogonal. I mean, also has the exact same constraint as fast ICA. So it really recovers the same solution, but much faster. And of course, our code is much longer than fast ICA. Fast ICA is really a few lines of code, and that's also why it's such a great algorithm. It's super simple to code. In order to have such acceleration, we needed to have a much more complicated algorithm.
Thank you. I actually had a question myself. Well, maybe this one. So Armin again is asking if the code is available for Picard.
Yeah, I will talk about it at the end of the talk, but everything is open sourced, and I will do a bit more advertising at the end of the talk about everything. But yes, everything is open. So it's for Picard, it's MATLAB and Python. So we did the effort to code it in MATLAB as well. But yeah, I will get back to this at the end of the talk.
Good. So yeah, I guess we can, in the interest of time,
okay,
get going. I don't know. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing anything on the chat.
You said that you had a question yourself, or I mean, maybe we can.
Well, sure. So it was about Picard, and yeah, the question was if this particular plot was referring to the case where the mixing matrix is not square.
No. So I will talk about the case where the mixing matrix is non-square. But one thing that is important, and yeah, maybe I did not insist enough on this, is that everything that I said before, I assume that the mixing matrix is square. And the important thing is that everything breaks down when the mixing matrix is not square, okay? Because here, so it breaks down for many reasons, but the first one is that when you look at the likelihood, here you see that you have an inverse. And so you must assume that this is square. And I will talk a bit in more length about this later. But basically, all the popular algorithms that you are using, they are not dimension reduction algorithms. They are always working with a square mixing matrix. I mean, the most popular IC algorithms cannot reduce the dimension. When you see a parameter in the algorithm to reduce dimension, it's most of the time because the dimension is reduced beforehand using a PCA, for instance. But here there is no no dimensional reduction. But that's exactly. But I mean that's a very good question, and it helps me a lot because it's the perfect transition for what comes next. And so, so the goal of today's talk is to go beyond the simple ICA model x equal a times s and to add some noise. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. And so my point is that the ICA model is simple. So as we've seen, it's very like it's the simplest equation that you can think of. And so having such a simple model is actually very great because the first thing is that being simple in itself is often a quality. And then you also have some practical benefits. The first thing is that, as I said, it's super easy to go from the sources to x. Okay, if I give you a and s, you can recover x. You just do the multiplication. And if I give you x, then you can also recover s just by inverting a. Okay, so it is seamless to go from s to x and to go from x to s. Okay, so to go from observations to sources and sources to observations. And this is actually for ICA, it looks like a very trivial thing, but this is not the case for many other problems. And the simplicity also allows to have, as I showed before, a closed form likelihood. And these two things together mean that you can actually have you can have some very fast algorithms. Okay, so this is important. The simplicity of the model of ICA allows to have some extremely fast algorithms. But now, the fact that it's so simple, it might be a problem. And so, as you asked, I mean, it's linked to your question. I think the point is that you cannot really do dimension reduction with ICA. And so the point is that, and so the first thing is that it's quite bad, okay? Because if X are your neuroscientific data, so MEG or EEG recordings, and then you say that A is square, it means that there are as many sources as sensors. Okay, and so for instance, if you are recording the MEG of somebody, you have 300 sensors, let's say, and so of course, when you want to apply ICA, because A is assumed to be square, you are going to recover 300 sources. But then if you record the same person but with EEG, you will have, let's say, 60 sensors, and so you will recover 60 sources. But of course, as you see, it's a bit absurd to work like this, because the number of sources that you want to recover, it should not be determined by what I call the hardware. It should not be determined by the device you are using. It should be determined by looking at the data and having a neuroscientific reasoning about it. And so the usual solution, and so basically all the IC algorithms, I mean, most of the IC algorithms that are used in neuroscience do not do dimensional reduction. And so the usual solution is, okay, I take the recordings and I want to only estimate 20 sources. The usual solution is to beforehand apply a PCA, okay? So PCA, principal component analysis, is going to reduce the dimension. So that's the usual pipeline. I take my data, I say I only want to estimate 20 sources, so I apply PCA to reduce the dimension, and then in this reduced space, I'm going to apply ICA. But this is a simple solution, but it can be very bad. Okay, and so I will try to illustrate it with this very simple example. So I take 3 sources. Okay, so I have these 3 sources, and the first one, you see, this is a very nice, clean sine wave, very beautiful. And then the other 2 sources are pure Gaussian noise. Okay, and then what I'm doing is that I am mixing these sources. I multiply them by a mixing matrix of size 3 by 3, and I end up with 3 signals. And here I've been a bit, it's a bit tricky because I took some very small coefficients for the first source and some very large coefficients for the other sources. And so it means that the first source, I mean, if you look at it with your eyes, you cannot really see in these 3 signals that there is a sine wave hidden somewhere. Okay, it's impossible to see, but it is still here. Okay, so this source is, if you want, hidden into the mix. Okay, and now there are, and I mean, as a proof that you can actually recover it, now I apply ICA on these three sources. I recover three on these three observations. I recover three sources, and here I almost perfectly recover the sine wave. Okay, so if I apply ICA directly on the original data, the algorithm will not have a problem to recover the source of interest. Okay, but now the thing is that what is usually done in neuroscience is to say, okay, I will do a PCA on these signals. And so, for instance, here I did a PCA to reduce the dimension by 1. I do a PCA to get only 2 sources, and then I apply ICA. But then the problem is that because here PCA selects for high variance, it will completely destroy the source that is very interesting, but that has a low power. Okay, so here I apply ICA on top of a PCA, and you see that ICA can no longer see that there is a sine wave because this sine wave has been completely destroyed. And that's, to me, a very important drawback of PCA. And to summarize, PCA, it selects for high variance. Okay, so it's going to select the components that have the most power. But it does not select for independence. And independence is much more powerful. Because, I think that the example that I should use speaks for itself. The point is that if you have a meaningful source in your brain data, but that is for some reason of low power, which has a very low amplitude, then if you do a PCA, you are going to destroy this source and you are never going to be able to recover it. And there are also many other reasons, but it's generally known that PCA is detrimental to the quality of the decomposition. And some people, so in this paper, they go as far as saying that if you want to estimate only 20 sources, you might be better off by just subsampling the channels. Okay, so by picking at random 20 channels and then applying ICA on this to see how. So it might be a bit extreme, but the point is that PCA can be very detrimental to the quality of the decomposition. So to me, the best solution to fight this problem is to have actually, as you said, Rogers, to have to estimate fewer sources than sensors, and so to have a model where A is not square, okay, and when A is rectangular. So here, for instance, I will say that X equals to A times S, and now A is a matrix of size P times Q, and Q is the number of sources. So I say if I want 10 sources, I will say that A is of size P times 10. But now the problem is that this model has what we call in statistics a degenerate likelihood. Okay, so when Q is smaller than P, you cannot write the likelihood of this thing, or you can, but the likelihood of this thing is always equal to 0. And so it means that you cannot really do optimization, and you cannot. This model is not really statistically sound. And so a way to, the very natural way to solve this problem is to add some noise. Okay, and to say that X is equal to A times S plus the noise. And here it seems like a very minor change. Okay, so I have this model which is just slightly more complicated. It's the observations are the mixing times the sources plus a small Gaussian noise of variance. Let's say that the variance is sigma square. But now the main issue, and I'm getting to the main point of the talk, is that when you look at the likelihood of this problem, so you, of course, because you are doing statistics, you want to estimate the parameters of this model using maximum likelihood. Well, the point is that instead of the very nice likelihood that I showed you before, you get this horrible integral. So, okay, so it's not so complicated, but you still have an integral to compute. And the point is that this integral, you cannot really compute it. And so if you really want to optimize this, so then you will want to maximize this, but you see that it gets very complicated. And so if you want to optimize this, you have to resort to some very complicated tricks or to some Monte Carlo Markov chain methods. And but the whole point is that the algorithm, instead of taking 2 seconds to run, it will take maybe 2 days. I mean, it's extremely slow, and it has some very big convergence issues. And so such a model is practically impossible to use on neuroscience datasets. I have seen very few people use it because it's just too long. But that's the model that you would really want to use. But the problem is that you can never infer the parameters of this model. So now the solution that we propose is to not use non-Gaussianity, but to use spectral diversity. And so spectral diversity, the principle is the following. So when you are doing the standard ICA, as I said, uses what we call non-Gaussianity. And so it supposes that the sources are non-Gaussian. So it can be like the burst that were asked in the question. These are the sources which have a non-Gaussian PDF. But then if you do the Fourier transform of this and you look at the power spectrum density, you get something that is completely flat. Okay, we say that this is a white signal. It has a flat spectrum. Instead, what we do is that we consider spectral diversity. So it means that so when you look at the time courses, it's not so clear whether the signals are Gaussian or non-Gaussian. But when you look at the PSD, here it appears very clearly that you have, for instance, for the blue signal, you will see that you have lots of low frequencies. And for the red signal, you have lots of high frequencies. Okay, and you have this kind of patterns when you look at the power spectrum. And so we are going to have a noisy ICA method, but with spectral diversity. And so we are going to take some frequency bands. Okay, so F1 all the way to FB1. So F1 can be maybe 1 Hertz, and FB can be 100 Hertz if you are processing brain signal. And then you are going to consider the signals that are going to be filtered in the frequency bands. Okay, in each frequency band, you are going to filter your signal. And the model that we call SMICA, so SMICA is for spectral matching ICA, is that the signal, the observations in the band, the frequency band number L is equal to A, the mixing matrix, times the sources in the frequency band L, plus some noise contamination. And the point is that we make the Gaussian assumption. Okay, so we assume that everything is Gaussian, basically. Everything is Gaussian, but S, so the sources in the frequency band L has a covariance that is PL that depends on the band. Okay, so you have a different power in each frequency band. And the same goes for the sources. And so, and the only thing is that the mixing matrix A here, it's shared among frequencies. And so you may ask yourself, okay, but how does it fix the problem? How is it easier to estimate the parameters of the model? And so the thing is that because it's Gaussian, you can only look at the covariance of the model. Okay, so we take the covariance of the sources, and the model, it tells you that the covariance should have this very specific structure. Okay, it should be A times the PL is the power of the sources times A transpose plus the power of the noise. And so when you want to fit the model, so when you want to estimate the parameters of the model, the only thing that you need to do is to compute these covariances, and then you need to find the parameters A, P, and sigma that best match this equation. Okay, so in the end, what you are doing is that you are taking these covariances and you are trying to match them with the predicted outcome of the model. And this is how you do the inference. And so you see, you don't have these very nasty integrals to evaluate and everything. So I won't talk into too much details about how we actually do this in practice, but it's much simpler and it's much shorter to do. A very nice thing about this method is that because we have a noise modeling, it enables something that you cannot do without noise modeling, and this thing is called Wiener filtering. And so the point is that when you are doing the usual ICA, you go from X, the observations, to the sources by just multiplying by a matrix. But here you can do Wiener filtering, which will give you like the minimum mean square error estimate of the sources. And so you have this formula, which is a bit nasty, but you don't really care about it. And the point is that it takes the noise into account. Okay, so if in a frequency band, the algorithm has detected that there is a lot of noise, then it will try to shrink the source in this band. Okay, it will be adaptive to the level of noise. And so you see that it's very different and it's a bit more complicated, but sorry, it's a bit more complicated than the usual pseudo-inversion formula, but it's also adaptive to the level of noise, and it's much more, it allows to actually perform some kind of denoising. And also another thing is that SMICA can also be used as a dimension reduction technique. It can be basically used as a replacement for PCA. Okay, so the whole thing when you are doing dimension reduction and in MEG processing is that you want to transform P signals into a Q dimensional subspace where you have most of the brain activity. what people usually do is PCA, and you find the subspace which has the greatest explained variance, but you can also just fit the algorithm and take the span of the sources as a subspace. And so in this subspace, the hope is that you have many independent sources. Okay, so now I will show you some decomposition examples. So I took some EEG data where I have 69 sensors, and I only want to estimate 10 sources. And so on the left, I show you the usual decomposition when you do a PCA to only obtain 10 sources, and then you apply ICA. Okay, so you get 10 sources, so I won't really go into much of the analysis. And on the right, you have the source estimated by SMICA. And what I want you to look at is the second source. Okay, so if you look at the second source, you see that it somehow kind of corresponds to the same source for the two methods, because you have this very strong peak, which is at 60 Hertz. So the first thing that you can infer, of course, if you are an expert, is that, okay, I know that you have a peak at 60 Hertz, so I must be in America, because this is where the line noise is at 60 Hertz. And then you see that there is something weird, okay, because the usual ICA algorithm, it only takes a peak at 60 Hertz, but there is no other peak. And for SMICA, there are two peaks, and it might be very, very spurious, okay? How can there be two peaks when I have the line noise? And so the question that we ask ourselves is, okay, what is the truth here? Which one of these two algorithms is correct? And so to try to answer this question, what we did is we used what so-called spatiospectral decomposition, SSD. And so the idea is just I take my data and I try to find the source that has the highest power at 60 Hertz. Okay, I know that I have a very big peak at 60 Hertz, so I try to find the linear combination of the observations that gives me the highest power at 60 Hertz. And then I can plot so it gives me a source, and I can plot the spectrum of the source. And this is what I get. Okay, so in blue, this is the spectrum that we estimated with SMICA. And in orange, this is the this is the spectrum of the source that maximizes the spectral, the power at 60 Hertz. And you see that it's really interesting. You also have a peak at 50 Hertz. And so it means that this is not what we can call an hallucination of SMICA. Okay, it's not something that the algorithm is dreaming. It's something that is actually present into the data. And so one explanation that we may have is that the signals are aliased at 250 Hertz. And so it might be, sorry, they are sampled at 250 Hertz. So it might correspond to an aliasing effect, this other peak at 50 Hertz. And so I have 2 points about this. The first point is that the other algorithm that did the PCA cannot find it. And so we suspect that it's because of PCA. It's what I told you before. PCA is going to select for high variance. Here you are facing a quite subtle effect. And so PCA, our guess is that PCA has completely destroyed this peak at 50 Hertz. But the point is that this peak is present into the data because you can find it quite easily actually. And so when you are doing your decomposition, here in the first algorithm, because this algorithm has not found the peak at 50 Hertz, it means that in all the other sources, I have this contamination at 50 Hertz, which is not the case for SMICA. Okay, so this was a very, not a very rigorous experiment. Now I have some more quantitative results. So you know, I mean, you may know that there is a saying in the literature that when you compute the sources of ICA, the sources should be dipolar. So by that, I mean that the coefficient of the mixing matrix should form something that looks like a dipole. And so you can compute the dipolarity of the methods on many different data sets, and you can actually then compare the ICA algorithms by saying that one algorithm is better than another by just looking at the dipolarity. And so here, in the x-axis, you have the residual variance, so the lower the better, so the closer to the left the better. And here you have the component count. And so basically, the higher you are, the more dipolar your algorithm is. And here, so the two methods that we propose are the blue one and the two blue curves, which are always and consistently show more dipolar sources. And so for this experiment, what we do is that we use SMICA as just a dimension reduction method. Okay, so we estimate 10 sources using SMICA, for instance, and then on top of this, we use Picard to estimate the non-Gaussian sources, because it's well known that the algorithms that give you the most dipolar sources are actually the non-Gaussian algorithms. And so you can see that the Wiener filtering, even when you have no dimension reduction. So here on the last plot, we estimate as many sources as sensors, and so we have no dimension reduction. But you see that you still have a slight but not non-zero effect of the Wiener filtering, because the Wiener filtering actually allows you to clean the data and to have some much cleaner data. So it actually helps as a preprocessing step. And okay, so yeah, one last word about open source code. So for Picard. So Picard, so we have a Python and MATLAB package. You can install it with pip if you are using Python. And it's one thing that is great about Picard is that it's actually included as an ICA solver in MEG. So MEG is a very popular MEG processing software in Python, and also in EEG Lab, which is a brain processing software in MATLAB. And so, for instance, in MEG, so just to show you how simple it is to use, so you have some imports. So this is some Python code, but so you don't really care about the top. Here you have 3 lines of code to just load your data. Okay, you read the data, then you define ICA. So you say that you want to apply ICA, you want to recover only 10 components, and you want to use Picard. And then you say ICA.fit of row, and row are your data basically, and then this is going to compute the ICA decomposition, and then you can look at the decomposition by doing just this very simple call to a function. So it's basically in 10 lines of code, you have computed the ICA decomposition using Picard on an algorithm on some MEG data. And for SMICA, so the SMICA is the last algorithm that I presented. We don't yet have a Python package, but you can find the code on GitHub. So I think I will send the link on the Slack channel afterwards. And it integrates very well with MEG. So basically, instead of doing from MEG the decomposition import ICA, you import it from SMICA. And then you only have you have to specify the frequency bins. Okay, so these are the frequencies that I told you about, and you have the exact same use, and you can fit the ICA, and it will do the dimension reduction, and it will give you the decomposition in a very few lines of Python code. So I think it's pretty neat. And I will conclude my talk right there. I will thank you all for listening to me, and of course I will take one last round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you for a nice talk. So there were more questions on the chat. I'll just read them. Let's see. The first one is from Chrissy, and she was asking about sorry. About your comment that PCA is detrimental, and she wanted to know in what sense, what is the quality measure that you used? And I made a comment that it could be related to PCA affecting the SNR of the data.
Yeah. So when I said here, when I said detrimental, I was basically referring to this paper, which actually gives a very I mean, they have lots of quantitative results about measures on why and how PCA is detrimental. So of course, as a side note, as you are all aware, it's very hard to say that one decomposition is good and one decomposition is bad, be it with PCA or ICA, because these are non-supervised methods. You don't really have access to the ground truth, and it's always it's like for the last experiment that I show you, you need to find some proxy for the quality of a decomposition, which is very hard to say. So for PCA, I think that here you can see that so in this experiment so obviously the true source that you really want your algorithm to find is the one that is found by SMICA, and not the one that is found by the usual PCA plus ICA, because this is the source that we find when we try to filter at 60 Hertz. And so we can never be sure about this, but our guess is that you cannot find this source with the usual ICA algorithms because it's been destroyed by the PCA. Because PCA has completely has destroyed this other peak. You see that here, I mean, between the two peaks, I don't really have the scale, but you may have 10 dBs of difference, so it's quite large. And so when you are doing PCA, it might be the reason that why this is destroyed. But of course, here it is just on a single example, so it means nothing. Here in the quantitative experiment, basically, we are using SMICA only as a dimension reduction technique. So it means that you use it as a replacement for PCA. And so using PCA, you get the red curve here, which is Infomax. And using SMICA and then Infomax, you get the blue curve. And you see, I mean, of course, if you believe that dipolarity and the number of dipolar components is a measure of the quality of the ICA decomposition, which is, of course, we can argue about this, and it's only a proxy of quality, but you still see that you recover some sources that are much more dipolar, which means that PCA, in some sense, has destroyed some interesting sources. And of course, there is also so this is a toy example, but I think it's still very interesting. Is that it's very simple to generate some problems where you have this very interesting source that is completely hidden in the mix, and that when you apply ICA, you recover it, but when you apply PCA, you have completely destroyed your source, and you can never go back from there. You can never actually go back and find what you have destroyed by PCA. So I hope it answers.
Yes, there is agreement that this was a great answer.
Thanks.
What else? So there are a few more questions about the particular toy example. This one that you're showing on the screen now, regarding whether it's a fair comparison to not to run like the dimensionality of the problem after PCA is smaller, and if that is a fair comparison.
Is it for
this the original problem?
For this example?
Yeah, that the number of components retained is only 2 instead of 3.
I wouldn't say so. Just to be clear, here it's. I mean, the question of whether it's fair or not is not really the point to me. So to me, the whole point is that if let's say that these are some EEG data. Okay, so this doesn't look like EEG data, but for the sake of it, let's say that these are EEG data. So when I give you this EEG data with only 3 sensors, you have 2 choices. The first one is to say, okay, I will apply ICA on my whole data. And then I recover this, and then you are extremely surprised and you are extremely happy. You see, okay, in my signals, I could not see anything, but deep down into these signals, there was this source, which is actually, it's a perfect sign. Okay, so here it would be very suspicious, but you recover a source that is very interesting to you because you are a neuroscientist. You are saying that, okay, there is this rhythm into my data, and I'm so glad. But then what people usually do, and of course here I only take 3 sources, but I could have taken 100 or 300 sources, the point would be the same. What people would do usually is to say, I have too many sources, I have too many sensors, I want to estimate only 3 sources, so I'm going to apply PCA. But then when you apply PCA, you are destroying the source of interest because this source of interest has a low power. Here it's really not about really being fair, it's just comparing 2 methods. The first one would be I apply ICA on the whole data, and the second one would be I apply PCA and then ICA. And if you want to use ICA as a dimensional reduction technique, what people would do is that they would run ICA on the whole data set, and then they would pick by hand the most interesting components. And for whatever, I mean, there are of course many different ways to measure what is interesting, and of course you cannot automate this. I mean, it's very hard to automate this process. But the point is, my whole point was that when you are doing a PCA beforehand, there is a chance that you are destroying some interesting thing, and it was not really about being fair or not fair.
Thank you. So I see here a very interesting question about MRI data and the relationship with normal distribution or Gaussian assumption. That in fMRI, the noise, at least the traditional way that we use fMRI data, the noise is Bayesian distributed and not Gaussian. So the question is, would it be able to use SMICA in that setting?
So I think that the first answer is that I think it's even worse than I think a bad noise model is that I think that in usual fMRI processing, be it spatial or temporal fMRI, and so you have these two kinds of acquisition. You can do ICA to recover some temporal sources or some spatial sources. I think that for both methods, I don't know of any use of spectral ICA. Okay, so let's not even talk about SMICA where you have this noise modeling, but let's just talk about ICA on fMRI. So I'm not an expert. I did my PhD mostly looking at MEG and EEG signal, but I don't think I've ever seen something else than non-Gaussian ICA applied to fMRI data. So I might be wrong here, but so the point is that on spatial fMRI, you recover some spatial sources, and so it doesn't really make sense to I mean, you don't really have a notion of frequency anymore. And in temporal ICA, in temporal fMRI, I'm not sure that you have such strong frequency responses, because here, if you take the MEG data, then you have this very nice variety of spectrum. Here you have some eye blinks which have a nice decay spectrum. You have the line noise which has a peak. You have this so you have some muscular activity, everything, and you have a very nice spectral diversity. And I don't think you have this in MRI processing, and so I don't think that you can really use a SMICA or basically any method, any ICA method that uses spectral information to process fMRI. So I might be wrong, and there might be some more people that are more experts on this than me in the audience, but this is what I think.
I think that's a good point that you're raising, and there were follow-up questions here that in fact, because it's a spectral decomposition method, you need it's based on temporal information, right? Yeah. So if you want to do spatial ICA of any kind, it becomes more challenging.
Yeah.
I would say that perhaps as it is defined right now, it cannot be used. But if you were to consider, say, three-dimensional or four-dimensional Fourier transforms, in that case, you could possibly extend this method into that setting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, but
did you consider that?
No, actually, that's a very good point. So yeah, you can consider some spectral. Huh? It's not spectral in the sense of time, but you can consider some spatial transforms of the data, and then try to perform ICA using this. I'm not familiar at all with MRI data, so I'm not sure whether it would work or not. So, the answer is quite simple. The whole point is whether you have some spectral diversity for whatever meaning you have on the spectrum. The whole point of SMICA is that it works. I know basically for all spectral IC method, they work because you see that you have some different spectrum here in the end. you can find some things that are some spectral signatures that look kind of different. And if you want to do this kind of extensions to MRI, I think that you will need to find some equivalent of the spectrum that gives you meaningful maps when you are maximizing the diversity of this spectra. But I think that I think this is something that is that has not been looked into, and that maybe there is something very interesting to do with using some kind of spectral ICA for MRI processing and for spatial MRI. But yeah, that's.
Thank you.
I can't have more.
There is another question here about the robustness, I think, of SMICA to departures from the Gaussianity assumption and stationarity assumption.
Okay, so I think that so this is something that I did not say in the talk, and I think it's something that is quite subtle, but that is very important. And the point is that I make the Gaussian assumption, and I make the so actually here I have a stationarity assumption. The assumption is that when I want to compute the likelihood of my model, I do a Gaussian assumption. So it's here, Gaussian model, and I also do a stationarity assumption. The only assumption is that you have this spectral diversity. But the point is that I make these assumptions just to derive a cost function. Just like when you are doing, so I will go back to the beginning. When you are doing non-Gaussian ICA, you are saying that your data is IID, okay, and non-Gaussian. But of course, in practice, you know that the data that you have, when you are processing EEG data or MEG data or any kind of data, your data is never IID. And so I think that we should really think of this as just a way to give us a cost function and to give us a maximum likelihood to optimize. We have this model and we want to optimize it. But the point is that if now I give you some data, okay, so if now I give you some data that is like this, okay, so here, so I'm not so sure, but here if you take the red curve, of course, it is not IID. Okay, this is not some IID realizations of something. But the point is that I think that it is still non-Gaussian. So when you look at the density of this thing, this is non-Gaussian. And so an IC algorithm that is based on non-Gaussianity, even though you are breaking the assumption that your data should be IID, the IC algorithm will still work, because it's not that you need the assumption of being IID. The only thing that you need is that you have non-Gaussianity. You don't really care about the fact that the things are IID. And this is the same thing for us with Gaussianity. What you need for SMICA to work and for the spectral ICA methods to work is that you have some spectral diversity. You can have some non-Gaussian sources. You can have some non-Gaussian, even the noise can be non-Gaussian. So I saw that there was a comment about the noise being Rician in MRI. The point is that if you have some diversity, you will actually recover the things. You don't really break your model by having something that is non-Gaussian. The thing is that the model will only look at the second order statistics, so it will do as if things were Gaussian, but if you still have spectral diversity, you will, in the end, still recover the correct sources. And also, this is why here, the two algorithms, for instance, the first source, it's a source that is both non-Gaussian and that has some spectral diversity. Okay, its spectrum is very different from all the other spectrums in the data set. And of course, if you look at the time course, you have these very big bumps that are typical of eye blinks. And here, a non-Gaussian algorithm will perfectly find them, and an algorithm based on spectral diversity will also be able to find this source. So yeah. So my point is that it's important to differentiate the working assumptions to recover a proper likelihood and to estimate the parameters of the model from what you need for the model to be identifiable, if you want.
And I think that's a good segue, talking about the assumptions that are required, specifically the spectral diversity, and how that relates to what is independent in SMICA. And I think, I don't know if that came across clearly, but I think it's the frequency, the frequency spectra, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, maybe I wasn't clear enough. SMICA works by finding sources that have spectral diversity, and that's so. If I give you some, so the point is, if I give you two sources that are completely independent and maybe they are even non-Gaussian, but then you try to fit them with SMICA, and if they have the flat power spectrum, actually just like this. Here, these two sources, for SMICA, they are the same and you cannot tell them apart because they have the same spectrum. And so they will never, SMICA will never be able to separate these two sources because basically the spectrum is flat. So you have no information, you have no spectral information for these two sources. A non-Gaussian IC algorithm will be able to tell them apart because they are non-Gaussian. But now the other way around, of course, if I take here some sources that have some spectral diversity, but that are Gaussian in the sense that the power density of these sources is Gaussian, then SMICA will be able to separate them, but a non-Gaussian algorithm will never be able to separate these two sources because for a non-Gaussian algorithm, if you have something that looks like a Gaussian, it will never be able to separate it. If you have two sources that are Gaussian, it will never be able to separate it, even if, in principle, there is a way to separate these sources because they have some different spectral signatures.
Right, and I remember now a comment that you had in the paper that these two, it was a suggestion that maybe you could combine the two algorithms, like the two steps, right?
Exactly, and so actually this is what we do in the last experiment. Maybe I wasn't clear enough, but in the last experiment we just use SMICA as kind of a preprocessing to do two things. So the first thing is that it acts as a way to do dimension reduction because here, for instance, we only estimate 10 sources, so we get we have 69 sensors. We estimate 10 sources using SMICA, and there is one thing, maybe the cherry on the cake is the Wiener filtering. So the Wiener filtering is a way to clean the data by taking into account the estimated noise, and so it acts as a PCA. I mean, the purpose is the same as a PCA, but it still selects for independence, and so I think that it's and here I mean for this metric it clearly shows that it's the right thing to do. And so, so here, after applying SMICA, we estimate the sources using SMICA, and then we apply Infomax on top of it. So we really combine spectral and non-Gaussian ICA, and this is what actually gives us the best result. Yeah. And
go ahead.
No, I thought that there was also one question about this. Here, if I apply SMICA on this, so I haven't tried it, but I am pretty sure that it would also find this because here it's very simple. These sources are like for SMICA is maybe the best possible case. You have a very strong peak at one frequency, and the other frequencies are zero. So here for SMICA, it's really easy to separate. And here for SMICA, even if I think that I will do the experiments and maybe I will send them into the Slack once that I run it. But I think that when you run SMICA on this and you tell SMICA to estimate only one component, it will give you this source. I'm pretty sure because it has such a strong spectral signature that yeah, to me it will make a lot of sense.
Nice. I'm seeing here an interesting question about model order selection. How do you, how is there a way you could use SMICA to choose the model order?
So we tried. It's something that we tried for a long time, and I am sad to report that we failed. So it's really hard to infer the number of sources in practice, because the first thing is that it's not a well-defined quantity. It's not really. It's just I mean, the sources that we are looking at here are just mathematical constructions, and they are not really. I mean.
if I show you 20 sources or I show you 30 sources, how can you say that one decomposition is better than another? It's very hard to do. No, we don't really have a way we don't have a way to perform a model selection with SMICA, but I think it's the same problem with PCI plus ICA. You don't really know what is the correct number of sources that you want to estimate if you use PCI and then you use ICA. What people usually do is that they say, okay, I want to only retain, let's say, 85% of the variance or 95% of the variance. But as you can imagine, this is something that will, of course, destroy, that will possibly destroy some very interesting but low power sources. So I don't really have we tried a lot. We tried with some statistical criterion like ICA information criterion or Bayesian information criterion. Because we have a likelihood, so we can compute the likelihood and we can try to find a rule to say that this is the optimal number of sources, but we could never never make it work in practice. So this is an open and very interesting, but I think it's also a very hard question.
Yeah, I agree. So we have a couple more questions, but I'm thinking maybe we take them on Slack, if that's okay.
Sure.
And we'll, with that, start to wrap up. I wanted to thank you again, Dr. Blanc, for this great talk. It was a joy, and we hope to see you around more often in the future. And thank you again for everyone for attending today. And we will be continuing this discussion on Slack on the coming days. So please come by, and we'll see you there. And I will stop.